Hello and welcome to the next video in the Kilpin Knitting Club series. Now you'll see I have a different set of needles in my hands this week. These are circular knitting needles. The reason I've got these is because today's lesson is going to be showing you how to do knitting in the round, or knitting with circular knitting needles. I want to show you how to do this because quite a lot of knitting patterns actually involve knitting on circular needles rather than straight ones. Now, the first thing you'll notice is these are not actually circular. The name is a little bit misleading. What circular knitting needles are is basically they're a set of straight knitting needles, but they can be a bit shorter than the normal ones that you might have used before. But they're connected with a flexible piece of plastic like this, so that when you start putting your stitches onto one needle, they can flow nicely all the way along until they come onto the other needle here. I should say I've got the door open because it's quite warm in here and the dog is sat outside drying off after her walk and her subsequent hose down, so I apologise in advance for any background noise. Well, why might you want to knit on circular knitting needles? Well, this is so you can create knitting that is in a tube shape rather than in a flat piece of knitting. And this is very common for when you're knitting things like sleeves for a jumper, the body for a jumper sometimes, if you just want to do it in one single piece. Things like hats, tea cosies, stuff that is circular or is round in shape. And what you'll end up with is you'll end up with a tube of knitting that doesn't appear to have a seam in it. It'll just keep going round and round. And what you're actually doing is knitting in a sort of spiral. So you'll knit all the way along as you normally would, and then you'll come to the end of your knitting, you'll go in a full circle, and then you'll just carry on knitting. So there's no flipping it over and doing purl and then flipping it back over and doing knitting again. You'll just keep going round in whatever pattern you happen to be doing. Circular knitting needles need to be purchased separately. I haven't provided you with any, and I don't have enough to be able to give out. So if you wanted to do a knitting pattern that requires you to knit in the round, you'll need to get your own. But there's plenty to buy on the internet. I got these on Amazon Prime. The best way to go about this is, if you think you're going to be really keen on knitting and want to do quite a lot of knitting, is the best thing you can do is get a set of circular knitting needles that are interchangeable. So these, let me see if I can show you. So this flexible piece of plastic is attached to these knitting needles with a screw. I'm not going to undo them because I have a special tool to help me undo them so they're nice and tight. But these wooden bits of knitting needle come off the plastic. This enables you to switch up what size knitting needles you're using and what length of plastic you're using. You might want to do this because different knitting patterns require different sizes of needle, and similarly if you're using different sizes of wool you'll need different sizes of needles, and I will go through that a little bit in more detail when I do my video on following a knitting pattern. But this gives you lots of flexibility, so you don't have to buy a specific set of needles just for a particular pattern because you've got everything you'd need at your disposal. You might want different lengths of plastic. Simply if you're doing an enormous piece of knitting you might need a longer piece of plastic to accommodate all the stitches. You'll notice this isn't actually a circular piece of knitting, it's got an end. The end is there. The reason I've done it that way is because the risk you run when you're knitting in a round is it's quite easy to get it twisted. If you get it twisted and then you join them together and then you start knitting round and round and round, if they're twisted, your entire piece of knitting will end up twisted. So what I recommend is that when you start knitting onto your circular knitting needles, you just knit normally. So you pretend that the other end isn't there, you pretend that this plastic isn't there, and you just knit in one straight line, turn it around, do a line of purl, turn it around, do a line of knitting. So you end up with, this is essentially one very big piece of knitting that would end up being a rectangle if I just carried on knitting it in this way. And the reason I recommend that you do that is because once you've got a few rows of knitting on your needles, here I've got 4 rows after I've cast on this edge here, it's much easier to see if you're twisted. If you just cast on your knitting and then you're trying to work out from there if you're twisted, you'll never manage it. I'm as well practiced as I am at knitting, I still can't work out if a cast on edge is twisted or not. It's so much easier to do once you've got sort of half an inch or so of knitting here to work from, because you can easily see if you're twisted or not. So as I go along these stitches here, if I go along you can see that none of these are twisted. What you don't want is for it to be twisted around the needle like that, like a corkscrew roller coaster. You just want it to be nice and lined up on your needle like that. You go all the way along the length of your plastic. It looks like mine's twisted, but actually it's not. If you go along it, it all bounces back to the same orientation alongside the needle like that. Obviously this is a bit easier if your knitting is shorter than mine is. But what's important to know is circular knitting needles are very useful for knitting either medium or large size projects in the round, and when you start following a pattern it will tell you whether you should be using circular knitting needles or double pointed knitting needles. Now these are knitting needles that are pointed at both ends, so you can knit from either end of the knitting needles. These I will cover in a different video, and those are what you have to use if you're knitting something quite small in a round. So if you were doing something like a pair of socks, don't knit your own socks, it's a waste of time. But if you really wanted to knit your own socks, you'd need to use double pointed knitting needles rather than these. If you were doing something that gets smaller as you go along, like a hat or a tea cosy, then you might start with circular knitting needles at the wide end, but then as you get further along, as you get towards the top where it gets smaller, you may need to use double pointed knitting needles as well. So I'll cover that in a separate video, but just to bear in mind that might be what you need to do. Double pointed knitting needles have the advantage of being you can knit on as small a piece of knitting as you want to. The limitation of knitting on circular knitting needles is you have to be able to reach from where you're knitting with your needles. You have to reach all the way around, and if your knitting is only that long, that's not going to reach. However short your piece of plastic is, it will not reach all the way along this needle, along the plastic, and along this needle to enable you to knit here. So you do need your work to be a certain length. But don't worry, the pattern will tell you which one you're supposed to be using. But do read the pattern all the way through before you get started and buy your equipment, because it may tell you partway through that you have to switch to double pointed knitting needles if your work is getting smaller and smaller. Alright, so just to recap, what I've done here on my circular knitting needles is I've cast on a certain number of stitches. It's quite a few. I've done quite a lot here. I didn't count as I was going along. I've got, I don't know, maybe 100 here that I've cast on, and I've knitted 4 rows of just standard stocking stitch. So knit, purl, all the way along. So I've ended up with one straight piece of knitting. I've not done anything at the other end except just turn around and come back, as I would have done if they were on straight knitting needles. And then what I'm going to do is join the 2 ends together so I can start truly knitting in the round. The reason I've done it this way is to make sure that my knitting is not twisted, which is nigh on impossible if you're trying to tell if a cast on edge is twisted. But if you've got an inch or maybe half an inch of knitting sticking out from the side of your needles like this, it's way easier to tell if your knitting is twisted. So what I'm going to endeavour to do now, which I'm sure is a lot easier when you don't have a tripod and a camera in between your face and your knitting, is I'm going to shuffle this end of my knitting. So this is the other end from where I'm knitting presently. That's just the tail that I started with. I'm going to shuffle these along this needle so I've got both ends of my knitting met up with each other like that. And I'm just going to double check. I'm going to go along with my thumb and just double check that this knitted edge is not twisted round the needle. You might be able to feel it. You should be able to nestle your thumb in this gap here in between the piece of plastic and the edge of your knitting, and you shouldn't have to put your hand around the plastic to get to it. You shouldn't have to be sort of contorting yourself around it. You should be able to do it in one straight line. So I think I am good. It might take you a few attempts to practice. You might get to a certain point and then think, oh god, I've lost it, I'm not sure. Just go back to the start and just check. You want to be confident. I think I've got that twisted. I think I do. So let me just untwist it. You watch, it won't be twisted now. No, it is twisted. I'm glad I checked. And if it is twisted, it's just a case of swiveling it around on your needles. It's easy enough to do, especially this plastic is thinner than the needles are, so you've got lots of movement around here, so that's nice and easy to do. Right, I think I'm set. Just bear with me. So I don't want to join this up if they are twisted, because my entire piece of knitting will be twisted and it will be no good to anybody. Right, I think we are good. It does look a bit twisted, but I promise you it's not. I've gone around and I've checked it and it's all facing the same way. Alright, so we've got our working yarn here. This is the long end that's attached to the ball. That's in my left hand, as it would normally be if you were knitting. And what I'm going to do is I've got the other end of my knitting here pushed right up to the top so they can eventually meet. I'm going to put my right hand needle into the first stitch as if I'm going to knit. Take the working yarn, which is this one, and then wrap it around and knit like that. So they're not really connected to each other. There's a gap there. Look, they're not connected. But if we do another couple of stitches, we can build up a few stitches to hold it in place. Okay, so I've got a few stitches now on my right hand needle that I've done. They're still not connected together. Look, there's a gap. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this tail of yarn that I started with when I cast on. This was the tail end of my slip knot that I created. We're going to use that now and take a tapestry needle or some other large needle that your wool will fit into and just put a few stitches, just sewing stitches, you know, not nothing special. Just use this tail of yarn, loop it a few times through these two sides of the work here. You won't be able to see it because it'll be the same colour, and if you do nice neat loops through here you won't be able to see it, and the result is this will look like one continuous piece of knitting. So I'm going to go and do that. I'm going to go and grab myself a needle. I'm going to show you how to sew this together really simply, and then we can carry on. Alright, I'm back. I've grabbed myself a tapestry needle like this. It's pretty big. It's got a fairly large eye in it. This is actually fairly small for a tapestry needle. You've probably got a much bigger one lying around at home. And what we're going to do is we're going to use, where's it gone? There. We're going to use our tail that's just not really attached to anything here at the end of our knitting, and we're going to sew these two sides together. So bear with me, I'm going to go and thread my needle. So you've got to be careful here that you don't let go of any of your stitches that are on your needles. These three that I've done already in particular are a little bit loose and are prone to slipping off, like they're moving around a lot here. These ones here should be fine because they're anchored to the rest of your knitting, but here they're a little bit on their own, so we do need to be quite careful. So what I recommend you do is get hold of the crossover where your needles are meeting here. Get hold of these stitches with your left hand, or your right hand if you're left-handed I suppose, and just make sure they don't move about. I thread my needle here with the tail of the yarn, and I'm not going to do this in any particular way. I'm just going to thread my needle through these outer loops of each side of the knitting. It's the same colour, so you shouldn't really be able to see it. Nobody's going to be looking that closely. And I'm just looping it through one side and then the other side of my knitting here. And the idea is you're just going to anchor the two sides together, so in such a way that it's not that visible. And then I'm just going to weave my tail in, just to keep it nice and tidy. I'm just going to weave it into the stitches I've just made. There, and I'm just going to take the needle out. That's it. I've just done 3 or 4 loops, I wasn't counting, through the two sides. It still looks a little bit loose, but don't worry, as you keep knitting, this will just become a regular knitting stitch and it will hold together really nicely. And you'll just have this little bit here that's got some loops in it. As I said, I recommend you do it this way. Do a few rows before you tie your two ends together, because this is the best way of making sure you're not actually going to twist your stitches. Okay, this tail is also a really good way of telling when you've got around one round. So when you're following a pattern, you will need to keep track of how many rounds you've done. Same as if you were knitting a normal rectangular piece of knitting, you'd need to keep track of how many rows you've done. You'll need to keep track of how many rounds you've done here. How do you know when you've got to the end of a round? Well, it's when you pass this bit here, which has got the tail on it. Depending on how big your knitting is, you might get further and further away from this point, and it might actually get a bit difficult to tell where you're up to. So what I do recommend you invest in your knitting kit, and I do have lots of these, so if you really don't want to buy your own, I can give you a few. These are stitch markers. They are basically like safety pins, but they're made of plastic, so they're not quite as sharp and pointy and prone to stabbing you in the thumb. These are really useful at either showing you where a particular place is in your knitting, or they're even good for holding stitches. So if you were paranoid about these 3 slipping off your needle while you were doing that sewing, you can just put a stitch marker through that stitch You could put it through all 3, I suppose. We've only done 3 here, so we could have just done that with it and closed it. And that would stop those stitches. They wouldn't stop them falling off the needle, they might still fall off, but it will hold them in place and stop it unravelling your knitting, so you could then stick it back on the needle and then take your stitch marker out. The reason I mention this is because this is a really good way of keeping track of where the end of your round is. So I'm going to just, it doesn't have to be very specific, it just needs to be sort of in here. There we are, just in any sort of loop that you can find there. And that will show you that that is where the end of your round is. But the benefit of using a stitch marker is as you get further and further away, and as your knitting gets longer and longer, you can keep moving that marker up. So every few rounds you can just shift it upwards a little bit, so you can easily see where the end of your round is. Alright, so we've now got a piece of knitting that is in the round, because it's one big circle. And then we just knit as normal, really. The rest of this is all the same. If you were working on something that is going to get smaller or bigger as you go along, then you'll be using increases and decreases, just like we talked about in the previous video, and these will be illustrated in your pattern. It may be the same length all the way up and down, in which case you won't. You'll just keep going round. As with all pieces of knitting, I do recommend you keep track of how many stitches you're on, especially if you're a beginner and you're still learning. It's good to, if you know how many stitches you started with, it's good to keep track in every round how many stitches you've done, so you can get a sense of whether you're dropping any or not. Because if you're not increasing or decreasing, you should have the same amount of stitches at the beginning as you did at the end. So I do recommend as you're learning to keep track. So we just keep knitting now. Your pattern might have some purl stitches in here, but if you're just going to keep going round and doing one solid piece of knitting, it's always going to be knit now. We're not going to purl because we're never going to be working in the back. We're always going to be going round and round and round. And then everything else is just the same. You know, when you get to the end and you've finished it, you can cast off in just the same way. Nothing else about this has to be any different. So that's knitting in the round. If you get stuck, as always, please leave me a comment on the YouTube video, or you can send me pictures or videos on WhatsApp and let me know how you're getting on or if you've got stuck, and I will do my best to help. Thanks very much, stay safe, and see you later.